Expectations.
All right, we're at 12:32 your time, so let's roll.
Great. Okay, let's get started. So, okay, welcome everybody to the Grab and Go growth tactic this week. Tim and I are taking over for Jim. Jim is on vacation and reached out to me relatively late yesterday and said, "Hey, can you take the Grab and Go growth tactic session tomorrow?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I said, "What's the topic?" He said, "I don't know." No, he didn't. He did know. I just didn't know. But fortunately, this is a topic that I've talked about before, and it's an interesting one, and it'll make us think a little bit, I hope. But before we start, for those of you that don't know me, I am the gentleman in the middle in that picture, John Vanderslice, and I own a Sandler Performance Center here in New Jersey, which is very near Philadelphia. For those of you that ever had the pleasure of being in New Jersey, you may have flown into Newark Airport, which is our only major airport up near New York. Southern New Jersey down there, Philadelphia is much more scenic. New Jersey is actually called the Garden State. So you get very much of a misimpression up in Newark. So thank you for being with us. Let me introduce my co-pilot here and co-host, Tim Barry. Tim, can you talk about who you are and
Sure.
what you do and who you do it to?
Absolutely. My name is Tim Barry. I own the Sandler Performance Center down here in Fort Worth, Texas, the Republic of Texas. And just happy to be here. As always, I missed last week because I was in Phoenix tending to some family stuff. But other than that, I'm happy to be back and ready to rock and roll on today's important topic of bias.
Good. Well, welcome back. So here's what we wanted to talk about today, and this is bias in the workplace. And this is a subject. When I was in business school, we talked about this in one of my classes, and I remember when the professor first brought it up, I thought, well, what does this all mean, and what's the purpose of this? I had a misimpression, and I realized, first of all, I had a misimpression of the topic, of exactly what it meant. And then I also realized that I had a lot of blind spots around bias. So it really opened some eyes for me. And we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about just a couple different biases. And if this subject at all interests you, it's very worthwhile. Just go ahead and Google it. I mean, it's so much easier today, right, than what we used to have to do, go to the library and yank out a book or something. But Google workplace bias, and there's about 22 different biases. We're going to talk about a few today, and hopefully maybe give you some things to think about when we talk about bias. So here's a question in the chat just to kind of help us level set this a little bit. So when you hear this and we talk about bias in the workplace, and Tim, I'm going to count on you to look at the chat box.
Yep.
I'm good at multitasking. I know my limitations. So what does bias mean to you? When you hear that and you hear bias or bias in the workplace, what does that mean to you? I'd love to hear what your perceptions are or what your awareness is of bias in the workplace. It really would help.
So type it in the chat, everybody. What does bias mean to you? There's a whole bunch of different.
It's going to force me to do this.
There you go.
Somebody's got to put something in the chat box. There we go. Okay, good enough. So prejudgment. Okay. Go ahead, Sam. I'll let you read those.
So Steve Phones, it says your perspective or idea about a person or idea. My tapes from previous interactions running. When your views and interpretations are different than someone else's. Set opinions you have prior to dealing with the subject at hand. Those are some really good ones.
Yeah, and those are all really good. And I think in in many ways, all of those are correct. I really like the one that Tim said, my tapes from previous interactions are running. I was out walking this morning and I listened typically when I walk, I listen to books on tape. And there's a great book. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's called Atomic Habits. If anybody's read that book, Atomic Habits, really, really good. And one of the things they talk about that gets in the way of forming new habits is we have old tapes playing in our head. And sometimes we have to unlearn things. So yeah, I think having old tapes in our head or set opinions from the past, because of the way things have gone, absolutely lead to bias, right? And a fabulous book. It is great on audiobook. It's about a 5-hour book. If you use Audible, try listening to the book at least 1.2 speed. You get used to it pretty quickly, and it helps speed through those, and it makes a lot of sense. Great book. So yeah, bias. So one of the biases that I have found a lot in business when I was in the corporate world, and this I worked for a rather large German company, is called confirmation bias, which is the tendency to interpret or recall information in a way that supports what we already think. And I would see this a lot in the corporate world. And I'm curious if you think about this from your own businesses, right? We have, for example, you all know DISC behavioral style, right? You've been in mastery, you've been maybe organizational excellence, maybe even foundations, but you have some relevance to DISC, D-I-S and C. And D being a dominant behavioral style. One of the ways to pick out a high D behavioral style is they tend to state their opinions as fact. Well, I'll tell you the problem is, Tim only has blue shirts. That's why he's wearing one. That's why, right? Or something, or that person's lazy. I mean, it's obvious, right? They have a perception, right? And then what happens, we have confirmation bias, is we look for evidence to support what we already think, right? And it occurs in leadership. It occurs in a lot of different ways, that confirmation bias. So we have this set opinion of the way we think things are. For example, I was with somebody the other day and they said, well, nobody's wearing masks out there. No, come on, you're kidding me. Nobody's wearing masks. Well, I'm not going to wear one. Nobody's wearing masks. I said, that's absolutely crazy. I mean, we're driving around the city of Philadelphia. I said, everybody's wearing a mask. I mean, look at that. And he goes, look, there's a guy. He's not wearing a mask. I told you. She's not wearing a mask. So looking for things to try to support an opinion that we already have. So where confirmation bias can come from is we've had experiences, or we've had all had experiences, some good, some bad, right? And maybe we had some experiences that weren't so great, and we get in some ways a little bit wounded, and we have a perception. I have a client, for example, we're doing a hiring program for them right now. And his confirmation bias was, there's just no good people out there right now. You can't find anybody any good. So what happens is he would focus on the poor resumes that he was receiving and saying, see, look at this resume. It's people are applying, they have no experience. So think about that in terms of your own business. Do you have confirmation bias? Do you sometimes have an opinion and then you look for some information or some way to interpret the data to support what you already think? Does that make sense to you, Tim? I mean, have you ever experienced that? Can you give a relevant example of that maybe?
Yeah, it happens constantly. We do it almost automatically in everyday life. And I'll give you a personal example. When I went and bought a new car last December, I had chosen something that was going to be a little bit different from the basic transportation that you see on the road, and so I was really hunting for and researching something a little bit unique. I mean, you can only get so unique without buying a $200,000 supercar, but I was looking for something.
Jim Wilcox.
Yes, for sure. I was referring to Jim Wilcox. But I was looking for something just a little bit different, just a little bit off from and unique. And then I found what I wanted to buy, and then I went online and I researched it, and I kind of fell in love with it. And so when I got to the dealer, I purchased the vehicle pretty quickly. And the funny thing is that I had emotionally bought into the purchase in the first place. And a funny thing happened when I got on the road. All of a sudden, I noticed every vehicle of the similar make and model that I had just purchased. Now, I had really bought into the concept of this isn't something that you see on the road, 500 times a day. And then I got on the road after I bought it, and after I had put all this emotional capital into it.
So you had kind of blinded yourself to the reality that there really were a lot of those vehicles out there, right?
Yeah, and that's a good example of confirmation bias, and it didn't even occur to me until I was like, oh, there it is, right there. So that it happens in everyday life. We don't even think about it. It's like we're on
well, that's the thing with a bias, right? It is, in a lot of cases, it's habit, and habits are, in a lot of ways, we don't think about them. And Leo brings a good point, an excellent example in business where it comes up in employee evaluations. We go in and gosh, it's funny. If anybody looks at my LinkedIn, here's what I want you to do. I want you to put this out there. I'm going to put this out there. So I want you to go to my LinkedIn profile, everybody that's on this sometime today. Look at my recent activity. And I commented on a post where a gentleman had cited a Harvard Business Review article on what servant leadership was. Now, not to be unkind, but there's a gentleman that commented on it. It was anything but a servant leader. He was extremely difficult on people. He felt that he knew everything. No matter what the situation was, he knew the answer. You could not change his opinion no matter what. And unfortunately, it led to a bad end for him. He ended up in an early retirement. And I rarely do this, but he commented on this Harvard Business Review article as if he were a servant leader. Totally the opposite. And I made a comment on it. Read my comment and like it. Because it's really important that these dudes and dudettes that just do not figure out that they have these biases and how poisonous it can be to an organization, they need to be able to figure that out and come to some self-discovery. So in employee evaluations, in Leo's point, this gentleman would decide that somebody was not good, or they couldn't make it, or they wouldn't survive. And he would look for reasons why to support that hypothesis that he had come up with, as wrong as it was. So excellent. I've got to give a really big applause for Leo. Great example. I couldn't have come up with a better one. So this is now going to be called the Leo Point and Grab and Go growth tactic from here forward. Thank you. Excellent. The second is called recency bias. Now this is an interesting one. This is the tendency to overvalue the most recent information, good or bad. Typically, it tends to be more on the good side because that information is really fresh in our mind. Very much like what Leo said. I've seen this before. Now, let's see if this resonates with anybody. You've had an employee that maybe has not done so well, but all of a sudden they do something a month or a week or a day before their performance evaluation. And we're like, aha, look at that. Genius attack. See, look. Well, hey, look, they've really been trying. Look what they've done. And all of a sudden, all of the stuff that has not gone well fades to the background. And the things that the person has done well is now bathed in sunlight, right? And there's this recency bias of things. Like, for example, maybe we hear a good report that, oh, geez, we've tend to flatten the curve. And all of a sudden people say, oh, finally, this COVID thing is ending, right? And we give too much emphasis on that most recent thing that we read, and it leads us down a bad path, right? So how about that? In the chat box, before we comment on any further, can anybody relate or have an example of recency bias? Does this resonate with you? Have you seen it? What's your experience been? Love to hear about it.
John, I've seen in a sales role where someone will have really underperformed for most of the year, and then they'll hit that big jackpot sale towards the late third or early fourth quarter, and that kind of makes the recency bias kicks in, because when you really look at the body of work for the entire year, the numbers were okay. That he or she was able to save it at the last minute by hitting that giant home run. But overall,
and then we give too much emphasis to that. So here's what I would want you to do is I want you to think about this when you think about recency bias. Whenever you're faced with a situation, again, and I think the employee evaluation piece is an excellent example, we have to be able to look at the whole timeline, right? We all like a good story. We want, as human beings, we want people to win. We want them to do well. Hopefully we look for the positive, but we want to make sure that whether positive or negative, that we don't overvalue the most recent information. So it really requires us to look at things in a more granular way sometimes, to say, okay, it doesn't mean we discount it, right? Maybe it's the start of a great trend. We had a situation once in a turnaround in business. We had a great year, and the CEO of the company gave out moderate increases to the company. And he said, well, as far as I know, it's the best year we're ever going to have. And, the vice president was saying, wow, we have to give out big raises, big bonuses. So he was giving very much emphasis to the latest information. And that may have been a mistake. So Tim says, Bagley says, has happened way too often. He's an internal optimist. Yeah. So great point. Our behavioral style plays into sometimes the way we evaluate data, right? I have a client, he's going to be here this afternoon, a very high C. You could tell him, hey, we've had 3 great quarters in a row. And he would say, yeah, but that doesn't mean we're going to have a great fourth quarter. He needs a lot of evidence and a lot of data, where somebody else might say, wow, we had an awesome month. This year is going to be terrific, right? So that recency bias can cut both ways. Negativity bias is interesting. It makes us subconsciously it says more significance to negative things and negative experiences than positive things. Now, what that really means, we have a negativity bias, and I tell this to my clients. There was a study at University of Pennsylvania. It sounds kind of crazy, but it's true. How somebody did this, I don't know. But they showed people 2 doors. One said this leads to death and eternal damnation. The other door says this leads to unknown. And more people chose the door that said death and eternal damnation because they were afraid of the unknown. So here's what happens psychologically as human beings. I'm not saying it happens with everybody, but psychologists tell us that here's what happens. In the face of uncertainty, when the outcome is uncertain, we tend to give more credence to a negative outcome than a positive outcome. Doesn't mean it's going to be true, and it doesn't mean it's true for everyone, and it doesn't mean we can't overcome that. But I know myself, I think I'm a pretty optimistic guy, but sometimes I can start to tell myself a bad story if the outcome is not certain or it's unpredictable. I can start thinking, oh boy, things aren't going to go well. I've got a plan, and I tend to obsess over it. And my wife, I'm very fortunate. My wife is extremely supportive of me. She's very smart. And here's how my wife helps me counteract that. And this is something that maybe you want to consider is, John, what evidence do you have to support that, to say that will be true? Well, I don't have any. Okay. Right? So sometimes it's kind of catching ourselves and understand that trigger. And, Steve Fohn says fear can be behind the bias at times. Absolutely. So we have to ask ourselves, and going back to, I don't recall who said it now, maybe it was Leo or maybe it was Tim that said, we have old tapes playing. And so we want to think about, if we have that negativity bias and we feel that coming on, is it relevant? What evidence do we have to say that that is true? Because this is a matter of not just understanding it, but what to do about it. Okay.
John, let me jump in just on that one
Sure,
just
please.
for a second. This is where the negativity bias can really wreak havoc on a salesperson, because you may also call it head trash. And what we know about effective and successful high-performing salespeople is that executing the behaviors needed and required to generate new business is what makes them successful. Well, if you've got a negativity bias, here's where confirmation bias and negativity bias kind of weave together, where if you've got a negative bias in the first place, you start looking for evidence for why things aren't going to work, or you start adopting behavior patterns that are going to create that result. And so that's the danger in the world of sales, for sure.
Sure. And really what spillover bias is we will kind of take we'll take one event and apply it to another event. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. Well, if this goes bad, then that's going to go bad. If this happens, then that's going to happen, right? It's a spillover effect. And again, there was a really good book. My mother used to be an obsessive worrier when she was living. She's no longer alive, but sometimes she would have this irrational worrying about, things that kind of wacky. So I can say that about my own mother. But, and I bought her a book by Dale Carnegie called How to Stop Worrying and Stop Living, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. And what they talked about was be able to put things in day-tight compartments and compartmentalize things. And sometimes, one thing can go bad, and then all of a sudden we think that it's going to cause something else to go bad, right? Where someone does something not up to par in one area, and we think that's going to show itself in another area. And again, behavioral style can play into this. Again, my wife being a fairly high C, and part of her behavioral style, if you don't live up to a commitment, she kind of loses a little bit of trust and faith, thinking, all right, well, that means you're not reliable. Well, that's an example of spillover bias. Just because you forget to do something doesn't mean you're irresponsible. So be conscious of spillover bias as well, and how that can affect our thinking. Fundamental attribution error. This is kind of a bit of an odd one, and it's got several other names. I'm not sure why Jim picked this one, but this is really in this cartoon. It applies an unrelated incidence to a current situation, where in this case it says only in bad luck. How else can it explain the losses having the stock market? In other words, you attribute some outcome to an unrelated behavior, right? And it's I can't think of a relevant example in business right now, but you take some unrelated event and you say that it is responsible for the outcome, right?
John, I got one.
Go ahead.
I had a client who had a lucky pen, and whenever he would go into a business meeting, he would when he had his lucky pen, he felt like he had a leg up on being able to close that piece of business, and when he didn't have the lucky pen, it just worked out the opposite.
Yeah, right.
Kind of goofy, but that's what he thought. So.
And I think this will, I'm going to skip ahead here because I want to get more into things, what we can do about this. Jim had quite a number of slides here, but this is a form of bias. It's called bandwagon effect, which is you jump on the bandwagon. Well, it's working for everybody else, so it'll work for me, right? And again, can lead us down a bad road. Well, nobody else is closing business, so I guess there's no business out there, right? You know, our vendors are, tightening. I had this morning. One vendor, they're tightening up on credit. Okay. well then, oh, everybody's going to be doing that, or we should do that thing. So jumping on the bandwagon, just because it's working for one company, you tend to take it and say, okay, it's going to apply to everyone, right? And it causes us to think at much too superficial of a level, and not really, I like to say, get granular and understand a situation. We tend to think if it's happening in a few places that it's going to happen everywhere. And they term that the bandwagon effect. I'll just go through how many more. I'm not going to worry about that one. Bias blind spot is a tendency to see yourself as less than someone else. Because if you don't know some information, you make this assumption that somebody else must know more than you do. It's called blind spot bias. I want to get to the meat of this. So what can we do about bias? I think number one is kind of what we started here, is have an awareness and then tend to know when they arise. They tend to arise during fatigue. They tend to, when we're stressed out, when we're under pressure. For those of you that have had a divine inventory, or a DISC profile rather, in your DISC profile, it'll say, this is what is likely to happen to this behavioral style when you're under pressure. So biases tend to appear when we're under pressure, we're tired, we're stressed, and it messes with our cognitive abilities, okay? We tend to, again, somebody said it earlier, we jump to conclusions. We're doing multitasking, right? So we want to be able to think critically. We want to be able to be more granular. We want to be able to actually pull things out into the light and say, what evidence do I have that this is true, or this may go this way? Am I introducing bias into my thinking, or am I thinking critically? Okay. Ask yourself, what do I believe to be true? What evidence do I have to support this? What conclusions have you drawn? What assumptions have you made? And are those assumptions based on the data in front of you, or potential biases that are surfacing? And what meaning have you attached? The data. Were you looking at the whole picture? Again, if you think about recency bias, or you think of some of the other biases we talked about, we tend to look at only one piece. Now, this is a big topic, right? This is just today meant to help you think about bias and where this may surface for you. Or any other conclusions, or could I, if I had looked at the bigger picture, could you have drawn a different inference? Again, all driven around critical thinking. So it looks like we're right about on the bubble here, Tim, but let me ask, I guess I'm not going to go with that. Maybe one takeaway that you got. I mean, is this relevant? Do you think it not relevant in my world, or yes, I've kind of let this go out of my mind and didn't realize that, this was a thing. I need to pay more attention to it, or I'd like to know more. Did it reinforce anything, or something maybe you had not thought about? Just do us a favor and put a little something in the chat box there. If you don't, Jim's never going to let us come back, and you're going to get stuck with Jim alone. And maybe that's a good thing, but I appreciate you joining us. But how about in the chat box? Anything?
Steve Phone says, great call. Found it very valuable. Recognize our biases as a good step towards better self-awareness. Badgley says, funny thing about bias is typically is unconscious, so it's very relevant. That's a good thought right there. It's we do this so automatically. We have various biases so automatically. We don't even recognize it unless you really stop, drop, and roll and think about it. So that was a good takeaway as well.
Well, biases typically are unconscious bias, and also it's much like leadership blind spots when we talk about things. So Clarissa said, asking oneself, is it true? What evidence do I have to support this? Yeah, Clarissa, I mean, that's a really big one for me. And every time, I have to say, in the last couple of years, if anybody gave me a little bit of coaching, and I credit my wife with this, and said to me, what evidence do you have to support that? What what in your mind are you thinking about that says that may likely happen or it makes that to be true? So that's been really hugely important for me. And I think much like we say in selling, right, our value is much more in the questions we ask than the information we give. I think the questions we ask ourselves in situations like this are extremely valuable. So I really appreciate you coming on. If there's anything any of us can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Something we've not said much. Listen, we all have our own clients, but if you wanted to get, if you're a client of mine and you'd love to get Tim's perspective or Jim's, or you're a client of Jim's and would like to run something by me, we all work together and support each other. Leverage the network. Something that you know, maybe you want to hear something a little bit differently. We're not, nobody is ever stepping on anyone's toes. We're here to support you and give you as much help as we possibly can. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, okay? Be well, everyone. Have a great balance of the week, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you.